Okay, so we will just continue on with the urinary system study guide and just see how far we can make it through. I do have less time today. I have probably like an hour and 15 minutes because my clinical anatomy class was moved from yesterday to today, but we'll get through as much as we can. Okay, so describe the flow of fluid through the kidney. And go all the way out of the body. So if you know your anatomy of the urinary system, then you should be able to really describe the flow of fluid through the kidney. And this does want you to go into like specific detail, like not just, through the nephron, but through what parts of the nephron. So I'm not going to go through blood because we already went through the vessels, right? You guys know renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar, arcuate, interlobular. And then, so we'll just start at the nephron. And then we'll kind of make our way out of the kidney from there. Okay, so blood goes, and you guys should know a lot of this. Blood goes into the glomerulus via what artery? The afferent glomerular arteriole, right? And then the blood goes into the actual glomerulus. That's the ball of capillaries that's there. And we push stuff out of the blood and into this capsular space. Right, this is the capsule, and the space that's present here, right, the capsular space is where that fluid and the solutes first get pushed into. So stuff goes from the blood. If it's small enough to fit, it goes out here into the capsular space. Then the fluid is going to get pushed into the nephron tubule. And you guys know that there are multiple segments of the nephron tubule. The first segment here, this twisted segment, is the what? Good, the proximal convoluted tubule. Again, we typically will just say the PCT or the DCT, but you guys need to be able to write it out. You guys need to know the actual name. So the fluid's going to go through the proximal convoluted tubule, then it's going to go through the nephron loop. Right, and that nephron loop has a descending limb, right, that's the part that goes down, and then you have the ascending limb, the part that goes back up. Then we get to another twisted part, right, that's what convoluted means, right, and proximal means closer to the site of attachment, distal means further from. So it makes sense that this first one's the proximal convoluted tubule, and then the second one is the distal convoluted tubule. Then, after the fluid, the tubular fluid, makes its way through the distal convoluted tubule, where is it going to go? Good job. It goes into the collecting duct, right? And each of these little nubs that I'm drawing right here, these are where other nephrons are passing urine into the collecting duct. And once it comes into the collecting duct, it's pretty much urine, right? We might make some final little adjustments on water content, but it's pretty much finalized. Then at the very end of this collecting duct, this turns into what kind of a duct? Good, a papillary duct. Okay, so papillary duct at the very end, where it gets dumped into this little funnel, right? This little cup, and that's called a what? Minor calyx. Okay, a minor calyx. So if we were looking at a kidney, you would see, right, the kidney's like this, the cortex is this area around the outside, and then you have these, oops, wrong side, and then you have these renal pyramids, right? And this whole nephron part would be out here in the cortex. And it kind of dips down a little bit, and then it dumps into the collecting duct. And this collecting duct is bringing us down this renal pyramid. And then the very bottom of it right here is at the renal papilla. And then this minor calyx is around the bottom of that renal pyramid. And so there would be another minor calyx over here at the bottom of this renal pyramid, right? And that's repeated everywhere. And then these minor calyces come together, right? And they form kind of a larger funnel. So when we have a minor calyx and another minor calyx coming together, what's this next area called? Good, a major calyx. Then all of the major calyces, right, plurals, calyces, all of the major calyces end up merging together, right? And then they form this really large, opposite thing, this really large funnel that leads out of the kidney, and that's called what? Good, the renal pelvis. And so that renal pelvis is leading out of the, I'm going to transfer up here now. The renal pelvis, which is like this area right here, is funneling the urine, because it's just completely urine now. It's a complete waste product. It's funneling urine down into this tube that runs down the back. And what's this tube called? A ureter. How many of them do we have? Two, right? Because we have two kidneys located in our lower, like in our back region, lower back region, and each of them has a ureter. And so the urine goes down the ureters, and then they dump the urine into what structure? Not yet. Bladder. They dump the urine, actually they dump it down lower, it would enter like down here. But they dump the urine into the back of the bladder. And we store that urine there, the bladder swells, it expands. We can typically get about 1 liter of urine into that bladder when it's really full. And then when we're ready for the urine to leave the body, it leaves via the, there it is, the urethra. Ta-da! That's it. Compare and contrast cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. So their location, the difference in their structure, reabsorption of materials, enter what vessels, and their function. Can I bring my water? Oh, what a bummer. I'm going to have to go grab it in a second. There's no way I can talk for very long without water. Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Okay, so we have two different types of nephrons that filter the blood. We'll draw them actually, sorry, over here. That filter the blood to produce urine. We know that the nephrons are located out in the cortex. So out in this superficial part of the kidney. And so we have like the renal corpuscle, and then the proximal convoluted tubule, and then their nephron loop loops kind of down into the medulla just a little bit, and then the distal convoluted tubule, and that goes into the collecting duct. So that's like a normal nephron. It's got a normal size loop of Henle, or nephron loop, and it's located mostly out in the cortex. So we would call that nephron a cortical nephron, because it's located mostly in the cortex. Now we have another type of nephron that's called, you tell me, what's it called? Juxta what?
Juxta.
Medullary. A juxtamedullary nephron. And juxtamedullary is literally telling us, like, next to the medulla, or like by the medulla. So cortical nephron is mostly in the cortex. A juxtamedullary nephron reaches down into the medulla. Okay, cortical is in cortex. Remember, the medulla is this segment down here, the next section in. The reason that the juxtamedullary nephron reaches so far down into the medulla is because part of its tubule is different. Okay, what part of the tubule is different in the juxtamedullary nephron? The PCT, the nephron loop, the DCT? Good, the nephron loop. When we look at the juxtamedullary nephron, the reason it dips down into the medulla so much is because it has a very long nephron loop, right? Or loop of Henle. Okay, so it has a much longer nephron loop. Now, understanding that or knowing that is really important because that helps us figure out what the function of these juxtamedullary nephrons is. Okay, most of our nephrons are cortical. Okay, so cortical nephrons are more common. These are our normal nephrons that we use to filter the blood and produce urine. Juxtamedullary nephrons are special. We shift to the juxtamedullary nephrons in specific situations. Okay, so again, based on their function. So let's look at what the function of the nephron loop is, and then that'll help us kind of figure out what happens when the nephron loop is really long. In general, remember the point of this tubule is to perfect the fluid, to make sure that the urine that we're producing has all the stuff we want to get rid of and none of the stuff we want to keep. Because the glomerulus is not very smart. It doesn't filter things out, purposely based on, is this a waste? Is this a nutrient? Do I want this? Not? It just pushes it out. If it's small enough, it leaves the bloodstream. So we end up with this tubular fluid that's full of good stuff, right? All of our nutrients, our glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, we want to keep those things. We need those things to fuel the body. So we need to somehow get them out of this tubular fluid and back into our bloodstream. Okay, and that happens. As the fluid flows through the tubule, we reabsorb different things, right, in different places. We reabsorb a ton of water, ions, nutrients, etc. We also put things into the urine, right? So if I have a ton of extra calcium in my body and I need to get rid of it, well, I can pee it out. It's really easy. So we can just pump the calcium or potassium or whatever it is that we want to get rid of, we can put it into the urine. Okay, so that's the point of the tubule. Now again, each section has its own specific function. Off the top of your heads, what would you guys say the function of the nephron loop is? Perfect, to reabsorb water and salt. Because that's how we get the water, right? Water always follows sodium. Wherever sodium goes, water goes, just because of osmosis, right? The water is going to cross to the side that has more solutes. So that's what we see happening in the nephron loop. We'll talk about the specifics is, part of it we reabsorb the sodium, and this side, part of it we reabsorb the water. But in general, the overall point of this loop is to reabsorb sodium and water. So if you have a nephron, that has an extra long loop of Henle or nephron loop, right? So it's going down this far now. What effect is that going to have? What is it? Absorb more, right? You're going to reabsorb more water. If I'm reabsorbing water all along the length of this cortical nephron, right? I'm going to reabsorb whatever, we'll say this much water. But if I'm reabsorbing water along the length of this entire nephron, that's a lot longer, right? There's a lot more area where I'm going to be reabsorbing more sodium and more water. So that means there's less water in the tubule, right? So less water makes its way through this whole system, right? So do we have more urine or less urine when we use juxtamedullary nephrons? Less urine. Okay, so we are producing less urine. Where does that bladder end? Where does that bladder end up? Well, same place it started. Where does the fluid end up? Back in the blood, right? Right where it came from. It came from the blood, and now we're going to reabsorb it, and we'll talk about the vessels in a second, but it goes back into the bloodstream. Okay, so juxtamedullary nephrons have a long nephron loop that allows for increased reabsorption of water and allows us to excrete and get rid of concentrated urine. So what would be happening in the body that would cause us to want to use our juxtamedullary nephrons? Dehydration. Okay, perfect. These are important in dehydration. Okay, just any situation where you've got decreased fluids, right? Decreased blood volume. What's that?
Hemorrhaging too.
Hemorrhaging, yes. Anything that would cause you to have decreased fluids in your body. So, yes, hemorrhaging, you lose a lot of blood. So you want to keep as much as possible, as much fluid as possible. And the reason that I write this, the reason I write excrete concentrated urine, because it's kind of, you might think, okay, if I don't have enough fluid, why would I even produce any urine, right? Why bother? Why not just stop blood flow to the kidneys? You have to constantly filter the blood. You have to, because there are waste products that are constantly building up, and that's how we get rid of our nitrogenous wastes, right? The urea, the creatinine, the uric acid, those nitrogenous wastes get cleaned from the blood at the kidneys. So we can't just stop, bringing blood through the kidneys. But these juxtamedullary nephrons allow us to continue to filter out excess ions, to get rid of, just secrete and excrete waste products while keeping or holding on to as much of the fluid as possible. Okay, so that's when the urine would be like really, really dark yellow, because that's all the waste products and there's not very much water to dilute it. The last thing was what blood vessels surround the nephron loop to reabsorb that water into the bloodstream. So remember, we talked about this when we talked about blood flow in the first part. We said that there are capillaries, right, that surround the tubule so that we can take all of this stuff that we reabsorb and bring it back into the bloodstream. So like if I'm reabsorbing glucose from the tubule, it leaves the tubule and it goes into this interstitial fluid out here. Well, I actually want it in the blood. So we've got capillaries that surround the tubules so that whatever it is that we're reabsorbing can then hop right into the bloodstream again. Because, and we said that these capillaries are called peritubular capillaries. Right, that makes sense. Peritubular, like they're around the tubule. So in the normal cortical nephron, the substances that are reabsorbed enter into the peritubular capillaries. Now, juxtamedullary nephrons, because they have this extra long nephron loop, they have these extra these extra vessels that are present, these really long, straight vessels that go along that nephron loop. They still have the peritubular capillaries up top, but they have these extra vessels to go down around the long nephron loop. And those are the vessels of the vasa recta. Okay, vasa recta. Okay. I think that's good. All right, so then now we'll just go through the tubule, the nephron tubule, and we'll talk about all of the different functions. So like what's the primary function of each part of the nephron tubule? Again, overall, the function is to perfect the urine, right? To reabsorb the good stuff, pump in extra bad stuff. But each section of the tubule has its own job. Okay, so we'll just kind of follow the nephron. So the first part is, what's the primary function of the PCT? All right, when fluid, right, once it goes into the tubule, we'll call it tubular fluid, because it's not really urine yet. It's not blood anymore, so tubular fluid. When the tubular fluid flows through the proximal convoluted tubule, it's like really raw, right? We haven't done anything to it yet. So the proximal convoluted tubule has a really, really big job, since it's like the first thing to get a hold of this fluid. And there are a lot of various things that happen in the PCT. Okay, there's some reabsorption, there's some secretion, like there's a lot that happens there. But there is one primary function of the PCT. What is that? Like, is reabsorption more important there? Is secretion? Reabsorption. Okay, so when you think of the proximal convoluted tubule, you should think of reabsorption. Okay, the majority of the overall volume of fluid gets reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so just the majority of the overall fluid is reabsorbed here. So a bunch of water, okay, a bunch of ions, like sodium and chloride, because again, that's how the water gets reabsorbed. It's following all this stuff. But what else? What else gets actively pumped, right, or actively reabsorbed here out of the PCT? It doesn't get reabsorbed in other areas. It's really important that we hold on to these things. Nutrients. Okay, so 99%, almost all of the organic nutrients get reabsorbed in the PCT. Okay, in other areas we'll reabsorb more water, in other areas we'll reabsorb more salt, but almost all of our nutrients are going to get reabsorbed here in the proximal convoluted tubule. We talked about in lecture, we talked about specific circumstances where maybe some of the nutrients wouldn't get reabsorbed, right? So like there are circumstances when some glucose actually remains in the urine, like when people have diabetes, exactly. There are some circumstances where some amino acids might remain in the urine, right? If you've got a really high concentration in your blood. But in general, for the most part, all of the nutrients are going to get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream in the proximal convoluted tubule. So should you be seeing nutrients in your urine? No. Okay, so for nutrients, remember that stuff like glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. Are we reabsorbing proteins there? Why?
They're too big.
They're not there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. They're too big to get filtered out of the bloodstream, so they're not there in the first place to even have to reabsorb. Good. Okay, so that's the general function of the PCT. What are the specific processes that occur here? So we have, I'm not sure what I was getting at there. I think I was talking about like active transport of nutrients, right? Like active transport of nutrients. Water crosses via diffusion or osmosis. I'm not sure if that's what I was getting at there. I think so. Yeah, that is. How is water reabsorbed? Water is reabsorbed via osmosis. Because it just follows the stuff, right? And if we're reabsorbing all of those nutrients that got filtered out, we're reabsorbing a ton of sodium and chloride, then of course the water is going to follow, right? It's just going to get pulled via osmosis. Describe the reabsorption that occurs in the loop of Henle or nephron loop. Include the different processes that occur in the descending limb versus the ascending limb and the permeability of each segment. You guys already told me that overall in the nephron loop, we reabsorb sodium chloride, right, salt, and water. Okay, so that's the overall point of the nephron loop. Now the nephron loop is really cool in the way that it works. So the descending limb and the ascending limb have different permeabilities. Okay, when we look at the descending limb, is the descending limb permeable to sodium and chloride? Do they like diffuse out in the descending limb? No. Okay, so no sodium and chloride leave the descending limb. Is the descending limb permeable to water? Yeah. Yes. Okay, so the descending limb is permeable to water. That means that water is going to get reabsorbed as long as the concentration outside the tubule is higher than the concentration inside the tubule, right? Because water follows the stuff. So wherever there's a higher concentration of solutes, the water is going to move in that direction. We find that there is a high concentration of solutes outside the tubule. And we'll talk about why in a second. Because of that, the water, right, water gets reabsorbed via osmosis. And don't ever, you guys, like when you look at this nephron loop, don't memorize left and right, because different pictures show it in different ways. Like just follow the tubule. So start at the renal corpuscle, you know, go into your PCT, and then the first part that you get to is your descending limb. That's the part going down. Okay, so in the descending limb is impermeable to solutes. Sodium chloride, other solutes, they cannot diffuse across the wall of this descending limb, but it's permeable to water. So in the descending limb, water ends up getting reabsorbed via osmosis because there's a high concentration outside the tubule. When we get to the ascending limb, is the ascending limb permeable to water? No. No. Hey, what happens in the ascending limb? What are we reabsorbing there? Sodium chloride, right? We have pumps that are allowing us to reabsorb, and again, sodiums are a really important thing there. We have pumps that allow us to reabsorb sodium all along this ascending limb. So we're actively pumping out this sodium. Okay. So in the ascending limb, actively pumping sodium out. So we reabsorb sodium. Why would that be important? Like, why is that so important that we're actively pumping out all of this sodium in the ascending limb? So that we can reabsorb the water in the descending limb, right? So the more sodium that we reabsorb in the ascending limb, the more water we can reabsorb in the descending limb, right? Because all of these solutes concentrate this fluid outside the tubule, and that pulls the water out. So this is an example of positive feedback, okay? Oh, the reason it's positive feedback is because the more water we reabsorb in the descending limb, the higher the concentration of solutes is by the time it gets to the bottom. So if this fluid is really highly concentrated, then it's really easy for these, for the sodium to diffuse out, right? Or to be pumped out. It's really easy for that sodium to leave in the ascending limb. So the more water we reabsorb, the more sodium we reabsorb. The more sodium we reabsorb, the more water we reabsorb. Okay, so that is one of those rare examples of a positive feedback loop. Okay. Again, there are a lot of details for each of these segments. This is kind of like overall, right? The overall point of what's happening in each area. When we get to the DCT, right, the distal convoluted tubule, we have a process called selective reabsorption. What does that mean? Thus far, we've just had reabsorption occurs. Reabsorption. Why is selective reabsorption different?
It regulates different hormones, so it depends on what's going on in the body.
It's regulated by hormones, right? So it's not regulating hormones, but hormones are regulating it. Exactly. Hormones are the key theme there. PTH is a hormone that does have to do with this, but there are multiple for different, ADH is another, for different compounds. So this reabsorption is selective. It does not naturally occur. So if there's no hormone present, it's not going to happen. It only happens when there's a specific hormone to tell the DCT to reabsorb that specific substance, whether it's an ion or water. Okay, so selective reabsorption only occurs when the specific hormone is present. So only occurs when hormone present. So yes, it depends on conditions in the body, right? Because the conditions in the body are what are going to cause that hormone to be released in the first place. So if we don't have enough calcium, PTH is going to be released, right? Parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is responsible for a type of selective reabsorption, right? Because it turns on the channels that allow us to reabsorb calcium. Okay, so what hormones work in the nephron for selective reabsorption? We said PTH, right? PTH is parathyroid hormone. A parathyroid hormone allows us to reabsorb what ion? What was it? Calcium, good. Okay, that allows for the reabsorption of calcium. What about antidiuretic hormone? Good. It inserts the little aquaporins, right, that allow us to reabsorb water. What about aldosterone? What does aldosterone make happen? Makes two things happen. So what is it that's happening with aldosterone? What of potassium though? Not reabsorption of it. Excretion of potassium, right? So it trades the two, right? Aldosterone does reabsorption of sodium and excretion of potassium. And these two work together, right? ADH and aldosterone work together because aldosterone will come and have us reabsorb all of this sodium. So there ends up being a lot of sodium outside of the tubule and the very beginning of the collecting duct. And what follows sodium? Water. So then ADH comes, antidiuretic hormone comes, because the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, they're not permeable to water. Water doesn't just naturally get reabsorbed there. So ADH will come and it'll insert these little aquaporins, right? Little pores for water. So aldosterone made all of the sodium present outside, and then ADH inserts the aquaporins, so then the water gets reabsorbed as well. Right? Antidiuretic hormone, antidiuresis, anti-peeing. So more water gets reabsorbed, which means less water makes its way down to the bladder. Did we miss anything that we talked about? Okay. Overall, the reabsorption of the most filtrate volume occurs in what part of the nephron? So where's the most volume being reabsorbed? The PCT, right? Hence my nice exclamation point, right? A lot of the volume, the majority of the volume gets reabsorbed in the PCT. Okay, because we've got all that stuff being reabsorbed. We're actively pumping all those nutrients out. We've got a lot of stuff being reabsorbed, so the water is just going to follow it. Contrast facultative and obligatory water reabsorption. All right, so as the tubular fluid makes its way down the nephron tubule, we obviously reabsorb a ton of water, right? We said that we filter so many times more fluid than we actually make urine, right? So the vast majority of the water that gets filtered out ends up being reabsorbed. Now, reabsorption, when we talk about water reabsorption, there is facultative and obligatory. Reabsorption. When you hear this word obligatory, what does that make you think of? What does it sound like? Obligated, right? When you're obligated to do something, like you gotta do it, right? It's not a choice, it's not sometimes, it's gotta happen. So obligatory water reabsorption is reabsorption that happens no matter what. Okay, so this is reabsorption that occurs I don't know how to state that occurs all the time, right? Reabsorption that occurs all the time, regardless of any hormone presence. Facultative water reabsorption is reabsorption that does not happen naturally. It's reabsorption that we have to facilitate. Okay, facultative, we have to facilitate it. We have to do something to make this water reabsorption happen. Okay, so that is the reabsorption that requires some intervention, right, or some direction, i.e. hormones. So the water reabsorption that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule, is that obligatory or facultative? Obligatory, right? It just happens. The water is reabsorbed via osmosis and that's that. There's no like making it happen or preventing it. So obligatory water reabsorption includes what happens in the PCT. What about the water reabsorption in the nephron loop? Right, yes, it happens in the descending limb. Is it obligatory or facultative though? Obligatory, right? There's nothing that has to turn that on. Like it's The water leaves the descending limb via osmosis. That's it. So the PCT and in the descending limb of the nephron loop, those are both obligatory sites of water reabsorption. We cannot prevent that. We don't increase it. I mean, we can shift to the juxtamedullary nephrons, but like that's it. The water reabsorption in these areas is obligatory. Where does the facultative water reabsorption occur? Where's all the facultative stuff? Good, the DCT, right? That's all of that selective reabsorption. Just think of it like it's the very end. That's where we perfect things, right? We put in some extra ions if we don't want them. We take some ions out if we really need them. We do have more secretion of waste products occurring as well, but that's like the fine-tuning area as far as reabsorption and secretion of ions. So in the distal convoluted tubule is where we have facultative water reabsorption. What hormones are important for that facultative water reabsorption? We just talked about them, but.
ADH.
Good. ADH. Actually, DCT and collecting duct. Because it's what's happening in both the DCT and the collecting duct. And again, remember, like the collecting duct is kind of like a, because for the most part, it's not permeable. But we can insert some aquaporins into that collecting duct to reabsorb water. So the collecting duct is kind of a weird part of the collection system. But facultative water reabsorption occurs based on the DCT and the collecting duct. ADH is what actually inserts those aquaporins. What other hormone kind of helps in that process? Aldosterone. Okay, so ADH and then kind of aldosterone helps because of the sodium. Exactly. Good. Okay, so the JGC. The JGC is the juxtaglomerular complex. Juxtaglomerular, again, it means like by the glomerulus. The juxtaglomerular complex is right in this area, right here. So you have the afferent arteriole, right, going into the glomerulus. The proximal the distal convoluted tubule, there's a reason that I draw the tubule this way, right? The distal convoluted tubule goes through this area right here. And in this area, we have a complex called the juxtaglomerular complex. It's formed by cells of what's called the macula densa and then the afferent arteriole. So the afferent arteriole, you guys already know. The cells that we refer to as macula densa, those are right here as like part of the distal convoluted tubule. So there's part of the tubule right here where the cells are different, where the cells end up looking like really clustered together, like really crammed together. And those are specialized cells, the macula densa. So the parts of the afferent arteriole right here, and the cells of the macula densa from the DCT, those together give us the juxtaglomerular complex. The juxtaglomerular complex is responsible for maintaining a homeostatic GFR. Okay, so the juxtaglomerular complex monitors the glomerular filtration rate and makes adjustments to various things like the afferent arteriole, right? Constriction or dilation of the afferent arteriole, for example, in order to adjust GFR to get it back to normal, right? And again, GFR is glomerular filtration rate. This is just how much fluid we're actually filtering out of the glomerulus. Why is it so important to have a normal GFR? What happens if GFR is too high?
It affects blood pressure.
Blood pressure affects it. So if GFR is, or if blood pressure is high, GFR could go up because there's more pressure and they're pushing out. But why would that be problematic if we have a really high GFR? You're pushing more out, and that could damage the membrane. Again, I tell you guys, think of this filtration membrane just like a filter. And if I force water across a filter at super high pressure, you can break it. And you'll start to force really big things out. So if blood pressure, for example, is super, super high, you can start to see plasma proteins in the urine because you're pushing with such force that you start to force large things across the membrane. And that damages the membrane, right? If you're pushing really big things out at high pressure, you're going to hurt it. So if GFR is too high, you're going to end up hurting the kidneys, damaging the kidneys long term. What would the problem be if GFR is too low?
You're not filtering enough.
Perfect, you're not filtering enough, right? Like we said no matter what's going on in the body, we have to keep filtering the blood. That's how we get rid of extra stuff. That's how we get rid of a lot of waste products. Like we've got to keep doing it. So we don't want GFR to be too low either. It needs to be homeostatic. The juxtaglomerular complex is responsible for releasing hormones that help us control and paracrine factors that help us control GFR. Adenosine. So adenosine and renin are two of those. Adenosine is released, so juxtaglomerular complex. Adenosine is released when GFR is what? Too high. So when we're damaging the kidney, essentially. Adenosine is released when GFR is too high. And that's pretty easy to figure out. The afferent arteriole is bringing blood in. If there's a ton of pressure bringing a ton of blood in, the afferent arteriole is going to stretch, right? And that is going to, like these cells right here that are part of the juxtaglomerular complex, they're going to note that stretch. They're going to notice the fact that there's too much blood being pushed in at too high of a pressure. And that causes the release of adenosine to try and fix the issue. So adenosine is released when GFR is too high. What does it do to try and decrease GFR? Good. So constriction of the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole, again, is the vessel bringing blood in. So if this afferent arteriole, instead of being that big, ends up constricting and being this big, it's going to bring a lot less blood into the glomerulus, right? Less blood means less pressure, which means you stop damaging the membrane, the filtration membrane. Renin is released. So renin is an enzyme. We've mentioned renin quite a bit. Renin is super important. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is incredibly important for you guys to understand, really because that's a target for blood pressure. When we want to treat blood pressure, a huge number of drugs target the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We have drugs that target aldosterone. We have renin inhibitors, ACE inhibitors, which are like the most common drug prescribed for blood pressure. ACE inhibitors target this system. So this system is really important for you to understand. Renin is an enzyme that's released from the juxtaglomerular complex when GFR is what? Is too low. Okay, so renin is released when GFR is too low. This is what should happen, but for some reason when you have hypertension, the system goes out of control. Renin is released from the juxtaglomerular complex when GFR is too low. So what would the overall point of renin be? To fix that, right? Like overall, renin wants to, the function overall is to increase GFR so we can keep filtering the blood. Now, the way that it does this, the ultimate goal of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is to increase blood pressure and to increase blood volume. That's how it increases glomerular filtration rate. But it's not actually renin that's doing this, right? Renin is just an enzyme. So renin is the enzyme that converts angiotensinogen into what? Good. Okay, so renin, angiotensinogen is in the bloodstream. It's just floating around in the bloodstream by itself, and it doesn't do anything. It's inactive. Once renin gets released from the kidney, then the renin finds that angiotensinogen and converts it into angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 gets converted into good angiotensin 2, and that's the big dog. Like that's the one that has a ton of effects. What is it that converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2? ACE. Okay. That's angiotensin converting enzyme. Good. ACE.
Angiotensinogen is like a pro-enzyme, right?
Yes. Well, a pro-hormone. Pro-hormone.
Pre-thing.
Yes. Yes, exactly. A pre-thingy, you know, one of them.
One of them. Because pro whatever it is always the inactive.
Inactive, yeah. Yep. So angiotensin 2 is then the active component. And again, overall, the effects of angiotensin 2 are going to be to increase blood volume and increase blood pressure in order to increase GFR. That's why it's doing it, because GFR wasn't high enough. So angiotensin 2 has a ton of actions in the body, right? It causes a ton of systemic vasoconstriction, and you guys know that vasoconstriction increases blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 causes the release of aldosterone and ADH. And we know now that aldosterone and ADH work in the distal convoluted tubule in the collecting duct, right? And they increase the reabsorption of water and sodium and the excretion of potassium. No matter what I give you as an effect for angiotensin 2, you can just think about it and say, okay, would this increase blood volume? Would this increase blood pressure? Would this increase GFR? If so, then yeah, it's probably an effect of angiotensin 2. If not, then it's not. So if I tell you, I ask you, does angiotensin 2 cause vasodilation? No, that would decrease blood pressure, right? Or does angiotensin 2 decrease the heart rate? No, that would decrease blood pressure. Does angiotensin 2 increase urine production? No, that would decrease blood volume, right? Because the water's got to come from somewhere. It comes from the blood. So you can just kind of reason through it and say, okay, like, does this make sense with what the overall issue was to begin with? What does renin do? Know the entire progression from angiotensinogen to angiotensin II, including the enzymes involved. We just talked about that. The renin angiotensin aldosterone system has what overall effect? We just talked about that, right? Increased blood volume and blood pressure. Functions of angiotensin II, just talked about that.